Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Different formats of income statements. If you remember in the previous videos, we have discussed regarding the income statement. But basically, income statements cannot be only in one format, it can be in different formats. So what are the different formats of income statements? Income statements can be in the following formats. For example, it can be single step income statement. It can be multiple steps income statements. Also, it can be condensed income statement. So first of all, let us go for the first types of income statement. The first one is basically this one, single steps income statement. In the case of single steps income statements, if you remember previously we have discussed in the previous videos and also we have solved and we made the income statement. Under this one, basically first we record the revenue, right? And after that, we mentioned the different types of revenue that we received, right? Then after we mentioned the total of revenue. And after that, of course, we mentioned the second one, expenses, then different types of expenses, then total of expenses. Then from total of revenue, we minus the total of expenses, and we get the result. If this is positive, it is called net profit, otherwise it's called net loss. خب دوستا اینا الفرق بین یکی است. What is the special regarding, we can say, the single steps income statement? If you remember in the previous videos, we have classified revenue into two types of revenue, direct revenue and indirect revenue, or operating revenue and non-operating revenue. Also, we classified the expenses into two parts, operating expenses, non-operating expenses, or direct expenses and indirect expenses. Basically, those classification is not in the case of single steps income statements. It means that in the case of single steps income statements, we do not distinguish between operating revenue and non-operating revenue. And also we do not distinguish between operating expenses and non-operating expenses. So we consider all revenue as same revenue, and also we consider all expenses at the same expenses or as the same expenses. درست؟ اینجا کلاسیفیکیشن ما اصلا مطرح نمیکنیم. از هر منبعی که عواید به دست میاره ما منیس عواید میره نظر میگیریم توتالش پیدا میکنیم. به هر هدفی که ما مصرف پرداختیم نوشته میکنیم expenses توتالش پیدا میکنیم. درست است؟ در اینجا کدام فرق بین دایرکت و ایندایرکت، آپریتینگ و نان آپریتینگ وجود نداره. مگر یک به متوجه باشین دوستا، یک شکل ساده ترین شکل اینکم استیتمنت است و این معمولا با در قسمت های شرکت های سهامی قابل قبول نیست. تنها با کدام کمپانی با کار میره؟ شرکت هایی که مربوط به یک نفر هستند. درست است؟ یا پارتنرشیپ هم تا جایی میتونه چی کنه؟ اپلای بکنه. It is not applicable in the case of joint stock companies, right? Or we can say شرکت های سهامی. So in the case of those companies, so we will follow another format which is called multiple steps income statement. شرایط وجود نداره دوستا، به خاطر از اینکه بازی دلایل از خود وجود داره. چرا؟ به خاطر از اینکه تو اگه میخوای که مثلا مثلا یک شرکت بخری یا مثلا یک شرکت سهامی میخوای که سهمش خریداری کنی، پیش از اینکه مثلا سهمش بخری باید بفهمی که شرکت فایده زا است، یعنی فایده تولید میکنه یا نمیکنه. به خاطر که باید بفهمی که فایده تولید میکنه یا نمیکنه، یا فایده ایجاد میکنه نمیکنه، whether there is any profit or not. So for that purpose, not only the amount of revenue, even the types of revenue is also required. So you have to know that whether the business made profit or not. And the second point, whether the profit which they made is from the operation or whether it is from non-operation. It is also important for the business. And the same thing for the expenses. If expenses incur in the business, so you have to check that whether the expenses are from operation or whether the expenses are from non-operation. درست؟ یک گپ بسیار ساده دوستا، سعی کنین. من به طور مثال اگر که اینی رو کلاسیفای نکنم، درست است؟ من نوشته کنم به طور مثال بزنس 3 لک روپیه عاید کرد. امکان داره از فروشات خود 1 لک عاید کرده باشه، مگر 2 لک روپیه دیگه امسال زمینا رو فروخته باشه. درست است؟ اگر تو به طور مثال سعی کنی که والا مجموعی بزنس فایدهش 3 لک روپیه بسیار تشویق شی، بیای در بزنس سرمایه‌گذاری کنی، سال دیگه باز فایدهش از 3 لک یک دفعه بچن پایین بیاد به 1 لک روپیه. درست است؟ بازو ودا ور خطا میشی، میگه چطور والا من فایده زیاد تخمین کردم سال قبلی چطور فایده زیاد کرده بود، امسال کم شد. با وقتی که فرق پیدا میکنی سعی میکنی میگه 2 لک روپیه دیگهش مربوط به نان آپریشن میشه. اگر میخواید در شرکت سرمایه گذاری بکنی، شما کوشش کنین فایده هایی که مربوط به آپریشن میشه او رو مد نظر بگیرین. چرا؟ به خاطر که فایده هایی که مربوط به آپریشن میشه او ریکارینگ است. ریکارینگ این میمونه که هر سال به حقوق میپیونده و این فایده هایی که مربوط به نان آپریشن میشه امکان داره دریافت شده باشه، سال دیگه امکان داره فایده دریافت نشده باشه. درست است؟ So if you want to purchase the share of a company or if you want to make investment, so you have to see the operating revenue, not the non-operating revenue. Why this is so? Once again, because operating revenue is a recurring, it happens repeatedly, and non-operating revenue is non-recurring. It happened this year, it may not happen in the second year. The same cases in the case of operating, the same cases in the case of we can say operating and non-operating expenses. So this was the single steps income statement. Now let us see the second one is multi-steps income statement, right? In this one, basically we distinguish between operating and non-operating expenses as well as revenue. So what is the format? This is the format. Sales revenue, it means the amount which we receive from the sales. Then from that one, of course, we minus sales discount, sales return, and allowance. Then you get the net sales. Then from net sales, you have to minus cost of goods sold. What is cost of goods sold? I will explain in the next video, right? And then from net sales minus cost of goods sold, then you get, of course, operating gross profit or gross loss. Why it is called gross profit or gross loss, also I will explain in the next video. Then from gross loss or gross profit, minus operating expenses. And now we know what is operating expenses. Operating expenses in this case means selling and distribution expenses and administrative expenses. So whatever is the result of this one, yani actually که از طرف ازی باقی ماند. See, from net sales minus CGS, you get gross profit or gross loss. From this one minus operating expenses, you get income or loss from operation. Also, you can call it operating profit or operating loss. Then after this, plus or add other revenue and gains. Other revenue simply means non-operating revenue. And less other expenses or loss simply means we can say non-operating expenses or indirect expenses. We can say somehow, right? Other than selling and distribution expenses, other sort of expenses can be called as other non-operating expenses. So non-operating revenue to be added, and of course non-operating expenses to be we can say other expenses to be deducted. Whatever is the result, this is called income before income tax. Income, or sometimes we can call it net income before income tax. From this one, we have to minus the tax that we have to pay for the government. Whatever is the result, this is called net income for the year. So this classification is very important, right? So if you remember in the previous video, in the previous format, we had only the net income. But under this one, not only the net income, we have several sources of income. Number one, we have gross profit or gross loss. And number two, of course, we have operating profit or operating loss. And the last one, we have of course net profit or net loss. So به این معنی که در شکل قبلی ما تنها یک چی داشتیم، net income، net profit داشتیم. مگر در اینجا با net تنها نداریم، مگر بلکه چندین نوع داریم. شما اول از net sales پیدا کردن، باز از cost of goods sold که بعداً با تشریح میکنیم چی است. فعلا ما قبول فهمیم که قیمت تمام شده goods است. درست است؟ قیمت تمام شده goods پیدا میکنن، gross profit یا gross loss چی میشه؟ بعدش میگن gross چی معنی میده؟ ناخالص. چرا ایران ناخالص میگه؟ به خاطر که یک تعداد مصارفات اون مواجه نکردیم. From this one minus operating expenses, you get operating income or operating loss. From this one or to this one, add other revenue and less other expenses, you get income before tax. Then minus tax, you get net income for the year. So I'm not going to solve the example for this one in this videos, right? So I will solve inshallah example later on. Why? Because the subject now which I teach is fundamental or principles of accounting. Then it becomes much more complicated to follow all these formats and so on. But remember one thing, that in order to analyze the financial statements of the business, in order to analyze the income statements of the business, so we need to have a multiple steps income statements. So this is much more better as compared to the single steps income statement, right? So this was one of the format of multi-steps income statements. Multi-steps income statements, if we go in advance a little bit as compared to the previous formula, if we go much more advanced, so this is the format of multi-steps income statement, which we here basically usually teach in advanced semesters. So it has several sections basically. Operating section, which includes the following. Then it has, for example, non-operating section, right? In operating section, we have sales revenue, cost of goods sold, selling expenses, administration, and general expenses. Whatever is the result, we call it operating section. So whatever is the result of this one, of course, the result will be operating profit. Then the second section is non-operating section, non-operating revenue and non-operating expenses. After that, we have income tax section. But as income tax section, we have discontinued operation. What is discontinued operation? It is not the time to discuss this one. Inshallah, I will discuss in the next videos. Right? Extraordinary items, non-controlling interest, and earning per share. So this is much more advanced form of income statements, and it is used in the case of joint stock companies, right? The companies which they issue share in the market. This is the point. Now let us see, this is the solved example of income statements for multiple steps income statement. See, it is sales. From sales, we minus the discount. And of course, we got, for example, the net sales. From net sales, we minus cost of goods sold. Of course, we got this one, gross profit. From gross profit, we minus operating expenses, right? Operating expenses are classified into two parts, selling and administration. So these are somehow the example of selling expenses, and these are somehow the example of administration expenses. Then we find out the total of selling and the total of operating expenses. Then from this one, we minus from gross profit or gross loss, we minus this one. Whatever is the result, this is called income from operation or operating income. To this one, we have to add other revenue and gain, for example, dividend revenue, rent revenue, and so on. Then we have to minus other expenses and loss, such as interest on bond and notes, for example. Then whatever is the result is called income before income tax. Then we have to minus tax. Then whatever is the result, this is called net income for the year. So this was the format of multi-steps income statement, right? After this, the next format is basically condensed income statement. Condensed income statement is not it's basically a specific format of income statement. It is just basically the summary of a multiple steps income statement. Each year دوستا. The multi-steps income statement ما انواعی به طور مثال selling expenses چی کردیم نشته کردیم. details نشته کردیم. مگر در condensed فقط امیره به جای از اینکه کلش پای نشته کنه تنها چی نشته میکنه؟ توتالش. تنها چی میکنه؟ توتالش نشته میکنه. چرا condensed خودش فشرده مانه میده. یعنی به جایی که details نشته کنی تنها توتال چی نشته. به طور مثال این چیزایی که administrative expenses به جای اینکه کلش دیتیلز نشته کنی تنها توتال چی میکنه نشته میکنه. درست؟ یعنی خلاصه یک اینکم استیتمنت که در 5 یا 6 یا 10 ورق بعد نشته شود ما رو میتونیم در یک ورق چی کنیم نشته کنیم که خوب چی شود تحلیل شود و بررسی شود. And remember one thing, that in order to analyze and interpret the financial statements, so we should have a condensed income statements. A detailed income statement basically create problem, right? So we should know the overall selling and expenses. So whether it is whether this expenses increase or whether the expenses decrease as compared to the previous year and so on, that we will discuss inshallah while analyzing the financial statements. درست؟ بعد به خاطر تحقیق و بررسی و انالایز اینکم استیتمنت شکل کاندنسش به ما چی میشه بدل میکنه. کاندنس دیگه کدام کار نمیکنه، به جای اینکه دیتیلز ذکر کنه توتالش چی میکنه ذکر میکنه. سعی که اینا توتالش چی شده؟ هم دیتیلز گفته شده هم توتال. مگر در کاندنس اینمی مثال اگه دوباره تکرار کنیم سعی کنین به جای اینکه توتالش دیتیلز تکرار کنه چی میکنه توتالش. مگر یک گپ است دوستا اینجا. باز وقتی که توتال نوشته کرد باید تو اینجا یک نقطه بونی که آیا اینمی توتال از کجا پیدا شده نوشته است که باید رو به نام نوتس یاد میکنه. به طور مثال گفته که سی نوتس دی. اگه میخوای بفهمی که سیلینگ اکسپنسز از کجا شده نوتس دی رو چی کو سایکو با نوتس دی در پاورکی اینجا ذکر میباشه. به طور مثال اینجا برات گفته که خیونمو مصارف از کجا چی شده بعد است اومده. یعنی توتالش چند است به طور مثال توتالش 4,53,028. اینجا توتالش هم 4,53 بیشتر است. یا نوت یعنی خلاصه بر تو راهنمایی میکنه که اینمی مصارف از کجا چی شده به وجود اومده. پس اگه اینکم استیتمنتی که در 3 ورق و 4 ورق باشه توسط کاندنس فقط در یک صفحه میتونی چی بکنی شه بررسی بکنی. So this was the example of different formats of income statements. Single steps, multi steps, and condensed income statements. So I'm going to give example for condensed income statements in the next videos.